So we have a unit test on Tuesday. Monday is just going to be a brief little review, which also I'm checking binders that day. So just depending on how long it takes to check binders, that might be 20 minutes to answer your questions, 15 minutes. So try to work through all of it today and get those questions answered that you are struggling on. So for example, that quiz you just took, looking at the scores, a little rough. That quiz is, I literally pulled questions from the optional study guide, which is modeled after the test. So I know when I made the test retake, because a real test is made by district, but when I made the test retake, I made sure like all the answers were correct. I went back and fixed any mistakes that I saw from like the test bank. But occasionally there are some mistakes, so make sure that I'll make it viewable at the end of the day, that you review it. And maybe those could be questions that you ask on Monday. And you can also do corrections on your own paper over the weekend and take a picture, email it to me, I'll give you half credit back on the quiz. But I'm not like super worried about a quiz score, because whatever you score on the unit test, I'll match to your quizzes if it's higher. All right, so really focus on the study guides. All three of them, they're modeled after the test, which is taking Tuesday. So here's like your list in priority of what you should work on. Consider, if you haven't already, showing me your binder. So on Monday, there's even more time to go over stuff. But ideally, since you do have an hour and you already had some time in algebra, I'd really like for both of the required study guides to be at 80% or higher today. Okay, so try to get that done. I'll come around with my clipboard and check the constructed response practice test at the end. But ideally, that is your task today, and that would go in as assessment points for MATLAB, getting the study guides done. And then the rest is more optional to get your grade up. So there's that. What else? I think that's it. Any questions? I know next week on Monday in here, I plan to introduce the final exam project that you'll be doing, and maybe even try to work on it. That's why we really like to get those study guides done today. That Monday is just like last minute questions before the test. Okay, we'll get to that. I'll check in the ask questions as needed. The same questions you had from the quiz, you're probably gonna encounter those same issues on the test. So highly recommend you review the study guides. Okay, so number one on the constructed response, in case you didn't get that, or maybe you just want to see if you're right. Usually before the test, I'll post the key, but it's your job to kind of check it to see that you're right. Because when I grade you for this, I usually just grade for completion on the practice test. So number one, the cost of holding a prom at a venue is represented by the following function, where M is the number of desserts ordered. How much does it cost to have a prom with 850 desserts? Based on those rules. 1,000 or 4,000, yes. All right, and how do you know? Well, reread what your variables represent. And is number of desserts. So I gotta see where 150 best fits in. Does it best fit in between 0 and 200? So that's why this is the answer for when it's 150 desserts. And then it says, what about 250 desserts? How much does that cost? 6,000. All right, because again, you gotta see where it best fits in. 250 is not between 0 and 200. It is between 200 and 500. So that's why it costs that much. Also know, like if it had asked about, say, like 200 desserts. Reason I say that one is because it's like kind of on the border. which one would it be? Would it be the 4,000 or the 6,000 if it's 200 exactly? 4,000. Because only one of those inequalities includes the 200, and it's the one with the little line underneath. That says equal to. So when it equals 200 exactly, it still falls in this one. Okay, so questions on 1A. All right, now for 1B, graph the function on the coordinate plane. Note that X is hundreds of desserts and Y is thousands of dollars. So I'm probably gonna label that first, so that way I don't get confused. So X is hundreds of desserts. And Jordan, do you have the paper constructed response practice test? We'll hear it. Here's what we're working on it. So 100 of desserts, and then Y is thousands of dollars. And normally when we plot stuff, we use like tables, but when it's a piecewise function, which this is because it looks like that, like from what we learned in lesson 12, then I have to go based off of these rules. So from 0 to 200, it's all going to be 4,000. So I need to do that. 0 to 200, so this is where it would be 200, and the answer is 4,000 there. Now, for the circles that I'm drawing, I'm doing it based on the inequality symbols. It was 0 less than n, less than or equal to 200. Let's go back just to confirm. Okay, yeah. So this would give you an open circle because there's no little, what do you call it, line underneath. This one gives you a closed circle because there is a line underneath. You should expect that with these piecewise functions. And then everything between the 0 and 200 is 4,000. So you're going to connect these because everything between that is the same thing. Good. And then you do the same for the other two rules. So the other two rules starts at 200 and that 500. So if n is for number of desserts, find where 200 is for that axis. And go up to what the output is. And based on the symbol, it's either going to be an open or a closed circle. I feel like all the examples have had it where it's open circle first, but it can be a closed circle first. Like it just depends. Closed circle second for when the input is 500. The last interval starts at 500, ends at 800, and then that output is 7,000. So find 500 on your X, go up to 7,000, depending on the symbol, whatever type of circle. 500, 7,000, open circle, up until the 800, which is here, closed circle there, and then connect them. So questions on that? Stephanie, do you have this down? Check on class. From the paper you picked up early. Okay, so questions on this one? Questions on any other parts of the study guide? Oh. So now looking at the puzzle piece one, if you guys want to follow along. Number 5. On the first study guide. So Sarah's practicing her typing. The table shows her words per minute. At what average rate of change in words per minute does Sarah type from T of 1 to T of 3 and enter your answer as a decimal rounded to the nearest 10? So when you hear the phrase average rate of change, your mind should go to what formula? How do I find average rate of change? Okay, good. So that you need to memorize. So I will not be providing that on your test. You need to memorize that one. It's the same as your slope formula, except for now your graphs aren't necessarily going to be straight line. So you really have to pay attention to where it wants you to look for your average rate of change. So it'll always tell you. In this case, they want us to look where it's from T of 1 to T of 3. So in that case, maybe they meant to put W of 1 and W of 3. I think that makes sense. But we'll go with that. So they want you to look where T is 1 and where T is 3. These are going to be your coordinates. So then you pick one of them to be x1, y1. The other one to be x2, y2. Plug it into your formula and simplify. So the way that I labeled it, what's my y2? And then minus y1, which is over x2, which is 3, minus x1, which is 1. And simplify, so we'll use the calculator. We got to do 176 is 113 divided by 2, because 3 minus 1 is 2. And then simplify that, I get 56.5. Because it wants it as a decimal rounded to the nearest 10. 10 would be 1 decimal place. So, and it already is at 1 decimal place, so that even makes it easy. But that would be the answer. Let me see that the key is right. And it is. Good on that one. Nicholas, did you have a question? Number 3 on the constructed response. So that one is a good one to look at. The cost for dog sitting is $2 per hour for the first 3 hours. After 3 hours, the cost is $12 no matter how long the dog stays. The function C gives the total cost for watching a dog for 8 hours. So first, it's asking if it's a piecewise function. So I had you write the definition for piecewise functions. You need to have it memorized by Tuesday. But basically, can anyone explain how you know if it's a piecewise function or not? Jordan, maybe? Okay, so it looks like our graph that we drew in number 1. That's true, usually. It can also look like other types of graphs, but the reason why the graph looks that way is because there are different rules for different parts of the domain. So if you reread this description, and domain would be inputs, right? X's. We're comparing the cost for dog sitting to the time in hours, and it's labeled, so that kind of makes it a little bit easier. For different amounts of hours, is she charging a different rate? Based on this description? So they are charging different rates. So then you would say, yes, this is a piecewise function because there are different rules or expressions. There are different rules for different parts of the domain. Or inputs, whatever you want to call it. And if you want to elaborate, well, it's 2 per hour for 0 to 3 hours, basically. And then after 3 hours, so after 3 hours, the cost is $12. So that's her different rates that she's charging because they're different for different parts of the domain. Then that's what she's charging. All right. Next, we're drawing a graph to represent it. So the 2 per hour for the first 0 to 3 hours. That means at 1 hour, how much is she charging? 1 hour, we go up to. At 2 hours, how much is she charging? Well, it's 2 per hour, and then it's 2 hours, that's a total of. So then here. At 3 hours, how much is she charging? 6. Now, it sounds like it's per hour. So, meaning like, well, we'll talk about if you connect these dots or not in a second. But for number 4, like for hour 4, how much does someone have to pay? When someone hires them for 4 hours, how much do they have to pay? So then this jumps all the way up to 12 here. And so forth. At 5 hours, they pay 12. At 6 hours, they pay 12. Now, whether or not we connect the dots, depends. So can you have a fraction of an hour? Yes, you can. Can you have fractions of dollars? Yes. Now, depending on how they're charging, it's kind of like that one problem on your practice, like about the parking garage. They're not necessarily charging you, like if I were to say half an hour, my dog, that they're charging me $1. Does that make sense? Like they're not doing that. It's just for the first hour, it is gonna be $2. If it's like an hour and a half, I'm still paying the $4. Make sense? So from here, I would say don't connect these, but then after the 3, maybe we can do like an open circle here. After the 3, no matter how long they stay, it's the same price. So you could do that. I would not say connect these because it sounds like if they are there for like an hour and a half, they're still gonna pay me $4. Right, so when you're deciding whether or not to connect them, ask yourself those questions. You might just have to leave them, or at least some of them, as separate notes. Okay, so questions on that one? Okay, now describe as completely as possible the domain of C. So the domain is referring to all the what in your function. So look at what's on the x-axis. What could be my smallest possible x? 0, technically. Even though, like, obviously they're not gonna charge you anything if they're there for 0. But that's their smallest. What's my biggest x? So I would accept that because they didn't say for a maximum of 12 hours. They didn't say a maximum at all. On your test, it will say a maximum. Make sure you use that maximum that they said. All right, but it doesn't say. So if you put 12 or 24, like for a whole day, then sure, I would accept either of those. Now, could time be a fraction? Is it everything between 0 to 12 that a dog could say? So in that case, we can use the inequality. And for the 0, it's always debatable on whether or not you include that. I'll just not put the equal to part. But even if they stay for 1 minute, they're being charged, right? But 0, maybe not. For this one, I will put the equal to part. So they can stay for 12 hours. You could also decide to, instead of doing that, if you forget how to do that, describe it in words. If you're describing it in words, you can say all non-negative, or you can just say positive like a normal person, but I'll use the words your test uses. All non-negative real numbers from 0 to 12. Now we can put the word 2 is already included in -2. Earlier, someone asked me that during the quiz, and I was just like, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. Real numbers would include decimals. Okay, integers would not be decimals. Now, last part of this one, describe the range. The range refers to all the what in a function? All the y's. So look at what your possible y-axis, what your y values are. Could they charge $0? Yeah, I would include the 0 just because I've seen other questions on your test include the 0, even though that might not seem reasonable as much. Include the 0. And then could they pay like $1? No, it's then $2. So they, like, what are their possible charges? And then could it be any other numbers outside of this? Or anything in between them? So then you would write it like this, is like these fancy bracelets to show my range is these numbers and only these numbers. Or you could just say, I don't know, in like a sentence, it can only be 0, 2, 4, 6, and 12. Oh, sorry. Sometimes you could charge like pennies and things like that, but it doesn't sound like this place is. So just go based off of that, whatever they say. All right, any other questions? Like the non-optimal one, right? Okay. So number 4. Bob is trying to figure out his cost for producing snow cones. The following function describes his cost, including any tax. So it gives you an equation and it gives you a graph. Bob uses this function to model the weekly cost in dollars of producing X snow cones based on the graph and the situation, which domain and range makes sense for function f. So if they just gave you the graph alone or the equation alone, then you could say all real numbers. But since they gave you a situation too, you got to relate it to like the real world. So for the domain, see the two things being compared, we got weekly cost and producing X snow cones. What would go on my x-axis? Weekly cost or number of snow cones? Good, because that's what's independent. The cost, weekly cost, depends on how many snow cones or cost. All right, so when we're asking about domain, we're asking about our possible number of snow cones. Could it be all the numbers from 0 to 50? Like, could I sell 1.5 snow cones? So then don't pick the one that says all real numbers or all numbers, because that's not true. And these could be shuffled, so just make sure you pay attention to this one. Could it be whole numbers only from 0 to 50? So that one's looking good so far. Let's see if we can eliminate any others. That one also says whole numbers from 0 to 50. Could it be all numbers from 0 to 125? So then don't put that one. All right, all numbers would include fractions, and you can't buy a fraction of a no. So then between these two, the range is different. So range would be my weekly cost. And note, they gave us an equation. I think it was this. Let me just double check. Okay. So if my weekly cost is represented by this, could it be whole numbers only? Or can it be decimals? So when you think cost, like, yeah, normally you could pay like pennies or something. So let's see, like if it's saying my domain is whole numbers from 0 to 50, let's see what happens when we plug in 50 for the X. What's 2 times 50? And then plus 25. Now, if I put in like 1, am I gonna get a decimal? If I just start putting in what my domain is. So no, because it'd be 27, right? If I put in 2, would I get a decimal? If I put in any number from 0 to 50, any whole number, would I get a decimal? So then you would pick the one that says whole numbers. Just because since we know the equation and we can like test out a bunch of numbers, we know it's actually not going to be a decimal. So really, if this was a graph of the situation, this looks like just from the graphing calculator, it really should just be like dots, not connected, because you can't have decimals of either. Okay, so let me just make sure the P is right. Okay, good. Questions on this one? The whole numbers for both. Questions on others? Have a time for one more today. Think of like what was hard on the quiz, then it would be hard on the test. Number 6. Okay, so number 6. On the online test, you'll need to graph an equation. So here's the instructions for that. But basically, it wants you to use 2 lines or 2 points on the line to make the line. And it should automatically do it with that line tool. So if it's this equation, you need to figure out what 2 points you're going to pick. This kind of gives you some steps to kind of have you pick good points. So it says which of these could be one of the possible starting points other than the x-intercept, and then it gives you some options. So what you could do is graph this and see which ones could be a good starting point. What do we normally call the point that we graph first? When it's in slope intercept one. The y-intercept. So what this one's really asking, like a possible starting point, it's really asking you what the y-intercept is. And then in the next question, it says which one of these would be the x-intercept. Because you could use both of those to graph your line. So here's my equation in standard form, but I know it's going to be a linear equation because we dealt with those before. To get it into slope intercept form, I need to get the y along. So start with what's farther. Would that be the 7x or the 4? What's physically farther from the y? And how do you cancel it out? Subtract it. And whatever you do on one side. And then so I have -4y equals, and I'm just gonna reverse the order, they're not like terms, but I want it to look more like mx plus b. So still negative, still positive. And then what's opposite of multiplying -4? And whatever you do on one side. Remember to do it to both terms. So then I have my y is, and you can leave it as a fraction, it just has to be simplified, so a negative divided by a negative, a positive. And then 28 divided by -4 is -7. So that's my y-intercept, the -7. That's a good starting point to graph first. And then your x-intercept, I'll just tell you right now, this is not your x-intercept, because you just found it to be the y-intercept. So it'll be 4 for the other one. But on a side note, x-intercept is when y is equal to 0. So if you had originally plugged in 0 for the y, you could easily find your x-intercept. Oh yeah, I forgot to check it. I'll check it on Monday. Okay, so don't lose your constructive response practice test, please. If you can't trust yourself to not lose it, upload it to the Coolidge. But I will check those Monday. I won't forget.